My title is The Art of the Covenant. And if I'm really super quick on my feet, I'd be able somehow to relate covenant and counterpoint. And I'm sure there's another sermon there. But maybe one of you can sort of back burner that and we can talk about it over coffee later. So, this seems to be a terribly interesting time. And yes, Chuck, when I wrote that word, I was thinking of that old curse. Some people say it's a curse. May you live in interesting times. This does seem to be a terribly interesting time to be a Unitarian Universalist. As a historian, I've always tended to look askance at folks who claim for any specific period, particularly if it's this present moment, special status as groundbreaking or momentous. But I'm always looking for ways to understand more fully the complex web of forces that bring any group to any particular moment. Even though I don't like to really, I'm not ever sure that like, oh, this is groundbreaking in brand new ways. I still am kind of thinking these last few months have been a little bit more, well, let's just say we've had more than our fair share, our usual share of important and pressing news from a relatively small denominational association. Our organizational heritage as Unitarians and Universalists stems, quite frankly, from the privileged white New England society of the 18th and 19th centuries, which includes deep respect for good order, especially in governance. And it seems very notable to me that we are, this month, heading into our General Assembly, our annual exercise in representative democracy, without an elected president or an elected moderator. Other top leaders of our movement have resigned in the past few months, and we've been having conversations about inclusion, diversity, and organizational structure, which, while not new, are being engaged with renewed urgency. And all of this interesting stuff is happening in the context of a national life in the United States that also seems to have departed significantly and repeatedly from the patterns with which we are familiar and the commitments that we have assumed were central to national identity and ways of acting in the world. I will admit that I'm having trouble knowing how I feel or deciding how I should be reacting to all of this. Some days my primary sense is of feeling overwhelmed and unfocused. I can't decide how much time to spend in the online world, which is my primary source of information, but I'm unsatisfied with retreating to my own very small daily circles. So I keep opening my email, logging into Facebook, reading articles and blogs and books, because I'm also finding something else, a sense of hope. A sturdy, historically grounded, implausible, but also unquenchable hope that we are living in a moment that may be a significant opportunity for something cherished and real to become yet more real. One of the characteristics of Unitarian Universalism that feeds my hopefulness is our long-standing tradition of understanding ourselves as a covenantal people. Last month, hundreds of UU congregations participated in a white supremacy teach-in. And one of the reasons I personally was eager and willing to engage in thoughtful conversation about systemic racism in our association is that the call to undertake this project came from UUs who are, what I'm seeing lately in writing, they are POCI, all in capital letters, that is people of color and indigenous. These are people, because they are UUs, who have a claim to my and our attention, because as fellow Unitarian Universalists, they are folks with whom we are in covenant. I understand myself to have promised to be in relationships of mutual respect, support, and encouragement with these people. So when they speak, I try to listen. When they suggest an area of our common life is in need of attention, analysis, and correction, I listen because I have promised to listen, not necessarily to agree, but to do my best to understand, consider, and perhaps stretch my thinking and my commitments. The idea of covenant in Unitarian Universalist life reaches back way beyond we were UU, back before we were even Universalists and Unitarians, to the Pilgrim and Puritan ancestors of our congregational forebears. Both the first pilgrims and then the waves of Puritans who followed them across the ocean to the territory that became New England used the word covenant to describe how they were related to each other, bound by promises to support each other and put the common good before individual gain. For these Puritans, as well as their descendants, our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors, this idea of covenant was explicitly biblical. So, I was a little surprised to find that the word covenant is relatively recent, finding its way into Christianity only with English translations of the Bible, where it has been pretty consistently used while describing relations between the divine and particular human groups to translate the Hebrew word berith, the Greek diatheke, and the Latin testamentum. I didn't really think you wanted to come along for a detailed etymological study, don't worry. I didn't even go too far into this myself. But all of those older words carry more the sense of a legal transaction involving a grant of goods or property from one person to another, as in last will and testament. That's not really how I've been hearing the language of covenant when it's used, especially from a Christian perspective. Quite possibly, our sense of covenant as involving mutual promises in a relational setting is a newer concept, not quite as biblically grounded as we thought. For UUs who may or may not be theist, our use of the idea of covenant has recently been largely restricted to the human realm. And just as a footnote, we might want to talk about it later or not, the First Principle Project, which I think some of you are familiar with, and increasing engagement with indigenous American understandings of human embeddedness. Both of those point to sort of an expansion of that idea of covenant or mutual relationship beyond just the human, but to the rest of creation, the rest of life. But back to covenant. Compared to the biblical use of the term, our understandings of covenant rely a great deal more on mutuality and equality between the covenanting parties, which does seem, actually, I'm going to go back to etymology a little bit, it is etymologically consistent. The word covenant literally comes into Middle English through the Anglo-French usage and derives from the French verb covenir, which comes in turn from the Latin verb covenire, which means to come together, to meet or to agree. Since co is together, venir is to come. It also has, come has the sense of movement, so it can also sort of imply traveling together, which is kind of nice if you think about it. Church, we travel together. I have to admit that I prefer this sense of covenant as an agreement between parties more than the legal versions in the original biblical text, which are about a legal transaction of, here, I give you this, and you give me that. Coming together feels to me more relational, more active, more embodied. It feels more lasting than passing on a gift of property upon death. Entering into a relationship of covenant is an ongoing, flexible process, at once more demanding than following minimum legal requirements for, say, probating someone's estate, and more sustainable in the face of extended effort required to nurture relationships and to create lasting social change. In this sense, covenant is not comprised of sacred inviolable laws or rules that can be carried around in an ark. It is not a legal contract. Rather, covenant is an art. It's a work of intention and creativity, a statement of our aspirations, a laying out of our hopes for our best selves and our intentions for living in relationships and communities of right relation and love. Since beginning to think about covenant a few weeks ago, I've been finding examples of covenantal thinking and relating in many places in our lives, not all of them specifically religious. So, especially for freelance ministers like I am, this is the season of weddings. So I've been thinking about weddings. Sometimes I even use the word covenant in my wedding ceremonies. There's also child dedications and baptisms and those sorts of things. Those kinds of, they're not the Sunday morning stuff, they're other things religious communities do. Those are about covenants. When we dedicate a child, we say to the child, we will care about your nurturing, and we will try to be there for you. And the parents and the child and the parents and the community and the child, they're all it's an entering into a relationship and an imagining that it is good for a nuclear family to be embedded in a wider community that cares. This is a kind of covenantal transaction. Education is about covenant. I mean, it is about laws and doing what the federal government or the state government or the local school board says you have to do to satisfy requirements and all of that. But it's also about a community of relationships. The very best teachers my children have had over the years have been those who are skilled at creating a community of learners together in the classroom. And this is a covenantal project. Other covenants are, there's been a lot of changing doctors and that kind of thing in my family lately. And so I've been signing a lot of paperwork. And I'm not going to say HIPAA is covenantal, but some patient-provider agreements actually do have an undertone of covenantal relating to them. We're people in a room, and here we're saying this is how we will protect this space, and this is how we will be with each other so that we can maximize the seeking of your good health and healing. Everyday negotiations in a household. And parenting, too. And I'm finding this especially as my children are growing older. They're their own people. They don't just do what we say. Like, they never were really very good at that, come to think of it. But it's more and more, as they become more and more their own persons, we are always, there's a lot of back and forth. And we are in relationship to each other and constantly redefining what we as a family unit are about. Professional oaths, such as the Hippocratic oath that doctors take, are examples of covenants. Ethical guidelines for a lot of professionals, different kinds of professionals have guidelines that they are bound by, and those also have a covenantal tone to them. Employment arrangements, or at least the best of them. If you've ever had a really good supervisor or really great work colleagues, you have a sense of what that kind of work and employment as a covenant can be like. Driving. I mentioned this. Y'all may have heard me do this before. It is amazing to me that we all go out there in our 1, 2, 3 ton vehicles and go really fast around each other and mostly don't die. Mostly. Things happen always in all sorts of places. But when I turn on the ignition of my car and go out on that road, I'm agreeing to follow the same set of rules you follow, and right. That's why we don't run into each other. And every time I start to feel like we don't trust each other, this is the problem with society, there is no trust between people, I remember that mostly I go out in my big car and I don't die, and I don't kill other people. And that's because we do trust each other. At least some places, at some times, there is a trust, and there is an agreement about how we will travel, where we're going. So I got to drive really fast getting here today, and it worked. International agreements, especially because once you get up in the agreements between sovereign countries, it's kind of murky about how those can possibly be enforced. Those are covenantal. People agree to do things together. Stewardship pledge drives, which I added to the list after I saw Chuck's email the other day. That being together as a congregation, but also trying to write a budget and trying to plan how we will have money to put in that budget and pay for these expenses that are necessary. This is covenantal too. Nobody can force you to do this, but if we all agree to do it, we can make things happen that can't happen if we don't follow through on those promises. That's living in covenant too. So there are many more examples y'all might come up with, but some of these that I've listed are more or less legal, but even those covenants or agreements that come into existence for legal reasons contain some element of the not strictly definable or strictly enforceable. What, for example, can the nations of the world actually do if the U.S. president pulls out of a previously negotiated agreement widely understood to be crucial to the flourishing of life on this planet? Well, we don't know. We might see. But it's tricky. That's hard. What can anyone do when a marriage goes terribly wrong? Marriage, we understand to be a covenant for the length of time during which both parties are alive. Well, that's a great aspiration. It doesn't always work that way. And it needs to not be. I'm not arguing that nobody should ever get divorced. Sometimes that is the most life-giving way to go. But still, that doesn't make the covenant of marriage not worth trying, not worth entering into. When we speak of covenant, therefore, I think we land squarely in the realm of hope and freedom. It can be devastatingly disappointing, but it's surely interesting. And perhaps our covenants point to an older, deeper story than the one typically told by historians, as was pointed out in this passage by theological ethicist Margaret Farley. She writes, "Civilization's history tends to be written in terms of human discoveries and inventions, wars, artistic creations, laws, forms of government, customs, the cultivation of the land. At the heart of this history, however, lies a sometimes hidden narrative of promises, pledges, oaths, compacts, committed beliefs, and projected visions. At the heart of any individual's story, too, lies the tale of her or his commitments." To paraphrase 20th century Jewish theologian Martin Buber, human beings are covenant-making, covenant-breaking, and covenant-remaking creatures. I believe we are human only in relationship, and that is inescapably the truth of our lives. To be in relationship, to be human, is to be engaged in making, keeping, breaking, and remaking promises. And these are the promises we make both to ourselves as expressions of our hope, and to others as the basis upon which we build the trust needed to, say, drive a car on a busy interstate. Writing about covenant for the UU World magazine a few years ago, UU minister Victoria Safford conveys the power of our ability to make promises in the face of both our tendency to break them and our inability to control the future. She says, "To act in these ways is to give our word. We send it out, and it carries our integrity, our fidelity, our faithfulness, our truth. Our word is still ours, but it calls back to us from the heart of another person or circle of people within which it now dwells. Such a commitment does not predict the future or set it in stone. It makes a certain kind of future possible." Clearly, we all see and know that our promises as individual Unitarian Universalists to affirm and promote our 7 principles, together with our promises as UU congregations and associations to trust and support other UU groups, do not guarantee that we live in a world marked by consistent respect for all beings, or the realization of democratic polity, or widespread appreciation of the web of all existence. But I think it may be our best, perhaps our only reasonable strategy for moving in the directions of our dreams. As Unitarian Universalists, we have committed to be a spiritual community devoted to living in covenant, rather than a people gathered around dogma. Over the course of our history as Unitarians, Universalists, and then Unitarian Universalists, we have declined to be deterred by doctrinal disagreements from transformative work in our world. We have committed ourselves not to right belief, but to right relation and right action. And so we are, I hope, a people of covenant, a people willing to risk naming our personal commitments and making promises to each other. And also a people who understand that living in covenant is always an imperfect art. We will not always live up to our high standards. Some days we will have trouble even remembering what they are. With luck, we won't all fail at the same time, so we can support each other in being called back to our truest selves, both individually and together. This is where I find hope for the ongoing health of our Unitarian Universalist Association and the flourishing of our congregations and the enduring loveliness of creation in both its individual beings and its webbiness. We live in covenant, which is to say that we live in hope and persistence and choosing over and over again to live by our best ideals. Even in times when we struggle to see and respond to the difficult truths about the many ways we have failed individually and communally to be our best, I agree with the statement of the current co-presidents of the UUA in their May 24th update, when they write that, quote, "The real energy and possibility we feel in these days could not have happened without decades of dedicated work from many individuals and groups of UUs. It is time for us to make real the vision that we already claim in our hearts." May it be so. May we be so.